So my name is Ruth Banzovich. I am the Church Engagement Director at the Faraday Institute, and it's great to welcome you here for our seminar. Our speaker is Mike Morecroft, who is Head of Climate Change Science at Natural England, which is the government conservation agency for England. He's also visiting professor at the University of Reading and president of the John Ray Initiative, which you haven't come across that, seeks to bring together science and the Christian faith in addressing environmental issues. Mike is an ecologist. He did his PhD on mountain plants at the University of Cambridge. I presume the mountains were somewhere else. In the late 1980s, this gave him an insight into the way climate affects the natural world. And over his career, Mike has worked on climate change in different contexts, from monitoring impacts through to developing approaches to adaptation and mitigation. And in his present role, he advises the UK government and works with conservationists, foresters and farmers, as well as building a scientific base. And he was lead author for the most recent IPCC panel on impact and adaptation. And Mike is also a licensed lay minister in the Church of England, and he's going to be speaking to us about nature-based solution for climate change. Thank you, Mike.
Well, thank you, Ruth. And yes, it is brilliant to be back in Cambridge. And no, it's the gift that keeps on giving, the fact that I did a PhD on mountain plants in Cambridge. But no, the field work was in the Highlands of Scotland. But I did live here for 3.5 years and met my wife here. And yeah, lots of happy memories. So good to be back. So I guess I'm speaking today with a number of different parts of my life coming together, really. Natural England pay me, so they're probably the most important, but I'll also be drawing on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report that I was one of the coordinating lead authors on, and as president of the John Ray Initiative, this bringing together of science and faith around environmental issues is key. Now, I am a scientist by background, and you will find this is perhaps 90% science and 10% of, I was going to say theology, but in this context, I'm not brave enough. So I don't know, personal, spiritual, Christian reflection. So my topic then, nature-based solutions for climate change. Now, I'll unpack as we go along what I mean by that, particularly the concept of nature-based solutions. But where I want to come back to at the end really is about how that sits within a conception of stewardship, environmental stewardship from a Christian perspective. And as I was thinking this morning, I added the question, because there are some contentious issues that I'll touch on as we go. So yes, I'm an ecologist. We've already sort of had the introduction, but in some ways I'm at my happiest in my natural habitat outdoors. I will be outdoors tomorrow at Woodwalton Fen. But I've also had the privilege of working internationally, particularly with the IPCC, and doing things like going to COP27 in Egypt. I've only been to 2 COPs. I'm not one of these people who keeps going to them, but I've seen that world, and I also work a lot with government policy makers as well. Though I should be clear, I'm not speaking about government policy in any way, shape or form today. And yes, I am indeed a licensed lay minister in the Church of England. I live in Hungerford, small country town on the border between Berkshire and Wiltshire. So I won't explicitly dwell on that, but I'm sure some of that permeates. My own research on nature-based solutions is mainly through this program, the Nature Returns program. This is very much from the professional perspective. It's my science, but also practical conservation delivery. And that's something I've become very passionate about in recent years, is actually how can we develop our understanding, develop science by learning by doing. We can't sit around and wait until we have a perfect understanding of everything before we try to solve the world's environmental problems. But we can start doing things, and we can learn as we go and do it better as time goes by. So that learning by doing ethos is right at the heart of Nature Returns. And there is a website there posted by our colleagues at Q if you're interested in finding out more. I'm going to pitch it at a somewhat more high level today, though. So this is where we're going. I want to talk a little bit about the effects of climate on nature. I'm sure for a lot of people, that's not particularly a new concept. Spoiler alert, it's not good news, but we'll unpack that a little bit. But then I want to go on to think a bit more about how nature in turn affects climate, from which the concept of nature-based solutions develops, and then to think about the human perspective, which is critical to all this, and then finally honing in more from the standpoint of faith as a Christian. So starting off with the effects of climate on nature then. And I think it's important to say right at the outset that climate shapes the nature that we see. And I tend to use the word nature because a lot of other people do these days. In some contexts, I will probably use the word ecosystems, but we'll stick with nature. We can argue about the definition of it at the end if you want. But also really critically, there's an interaction with the way people manage the world around us. So if you look at the macro scale, if you look at the global patterns of vegetation, the biomes of the world, that's what the map on the left shows. If you look at that pattern, you see that it mirrors a climatic map. And it's implicit, isn't it? The tropical rain forest, you know, it's a wet place in the tropics with consistent year-round climate, and so on. It's almost intuitive. We almost take it for granted. And it applies too at the much more local level. So this is from my my office window at home, looking at a field fair in the garden, feeding on some fallen apples. And these are winter migrants. They migrate across Britain in the winter. And then the picture on the right is looking down Langdale in the Lake District. And this is where I touch briefly on the mounting dimension. But if you look at the tops of the hills, they look different to the bottom, don't they? And again, it's almost, well, it is obvious actually. You know, you've got a more verdant sort of agricultural landscape. You've got trees at the lower levels and then bare at the top. But this is in many ways not a lateral landscape. And actually it's been shaped by the interaction of climate, soil, and human use of the land. So the agricultural landscape in the valley, it reflects the fact that that's where the higher productivity was from an agricultural perspective. It's the place where you could bring your sheep down in the winter. It's the place that was worth fertilizing. Well, good and ill to all of this, but the point is, it's an interaction between soil, that I shan't dwell on greatly today, but is critical, land management and climate. Now, in terms of change, and this is a figure that came from the last impacts and adaptation report of the IPCC, which is the one I was involved with. Every one of those symbols reflects a documented study in the scientific literature that shows a shift in the biomes of the earth. So these big macro patterns of where the different types of ecosystem, different types of vegetation are. So there are things like the boreal forest, the northern forest spreading into the tundra. There's things about the boundary between savanna and forest. And I don't know, 20 years ago, you might have seen a map projecting this as something that might happen. This isn't that. It's a record of fact of where change has happened. And the overarching picture is it's very difficult to explain those in any other way than as an effect of changing climate. And at the species level, we don't have many species that have died out completely, gone extinct globally as a result of climate change. The bottom right is one, the bramble cave melamis, which is a sort of Australasian island species that disappeared when its island home disappeared. the golden toad in South America is another possible. There aren't that many at the moment, but there's quite a lot that are on the cusp. And one of the most endangered systems as a result of climate change is warm water corals. So the bleaching of corals during a hot summer just tips the coral species over the edge of a critical threshold. They can recover, but it takes time. And as the climate changes, the interval between those, what's sometimes called marine heat waves, becomes shorter and shorter, and the time to recover increases. Other species at risk include the African penguin. People don't think about penguins in Africa, do they? But they hang on just about in South Africa. A lot of concern there about what can be done to try and help them. And here in Britain, the mountain ringlet, probably good for a while yet in Scotland, but in England, it was already on the margins. It's our only true mountain butterfly, and it has been decreasing. But I started saying, back with that picture of the Lake District, that climate doesn't act by itself. It interacts with all the other pressures that people put on the natural environment. And so this is a slide looking down on Amazonia, where you can see there's a burning happening. And it's made more likely by hot, dry conditions, but it's exacerbated by the fact that the forest has been cleared, it's been fragmented, roads have been put into it. People obviously have burnt deliberately, but also there's all the sort of indirect effects of that fragmentation. A small block of woodland dries out much more than a large continuous area. And it does matter for us as well. Nature, most of us, many of us anyway, would say has a value in and of its own right. From a Christian point of view, we didn't make it. It's not ours to do with as we choose. But also from an instrumental point of view for people, nature matters. So rather a famous review sponsored by the UK Treasury, not always seen as a great beacon of environmental activism, but this review by Partha Dasgupta, an economist, very eminent economist, had this to say, that we're facing a global crisis, the nature crisis. We're totally dependent upon the natural world. It supplies us with every oxygen-laden breath we take and every mouthful of food we eat. But we are currently damaging so profoundly that many of its natural systems are on the verge of breakdown. I'm not going to dwell on that aspect today, but it's been increasingly recognized that actually for human beings to thrive, we need a thriving natural world. And the interactions between the degradation of our land and climate change can also be illustrated in terms of the impacts on us. So this is the A591 near Thirlmere, back in 2016 after Storm Desmond, a very severe storm. And one of the projections of climate change is more intense storm events. And you can see it's been washed away. Now it's been washed away. It wasn't the effect of rain just falling on the road. The rain was falling off the hillside, falling on the hillside and rolling off the hillside at high speed and bringing with it boulders and gravel and goodness knows what. Now, this catchment it's not in great shape. It's been very heavily grazed, lots of short grass. It's not what it would naturally be. Now, the other side of the hill is Ennerdale, which has been subject of rewilding and the restoration of a natural river system and planting of trees. And it's a much, well, in terms of the physical hydrology, a much rougher surface, but it holds up the water flow, it holds the water back. And there was no damage that side of the hill, whereas there was damage on the Thirlmere side. It also caused problems for the water supply. So United Utilities, who own and manage both the land and the water there, weren't able to draw water through their purification plants because of all the sediment in it. And actually, since then, United Utilities in that area have been very proactive at restoring the land. So that was a brief view of the effects of climate on nature, with a nod to how that interacts with the other pressures on the natural world from us. But what about the effects of nature on climate? Now, there can be very direct effects. Think of a shady Southern European plaza, tree-lined squares. You can sit in the shade, or you can go into a park with a tree and sit under it on a hot sunny day. This is actually a heat map surface temperature of London, or the Greater London area. And it's on a hot sunny day some years ago now, but it's done through remote sensing, obviously. But the greener colours and the blue colours are cooler than the redder colours. And you can see, if you look at the patchwork, the middle of London is rather redder because there's less green space. And if you look carefully, you can pick out where the parks of London are. Those are the green bits. They're a bit cooler. Not just because of shade, it's also water evaporates from grass, and that has a cooling effect. So there's a direct effect then of the natural world on climate, or microclimate, local climate. But of course, the fossil fuel emissions that lead to global climate change well, they're not a natural process, are they? But it's about releasing carbon that was fixed by the natural world millions upon millions of years ago, releasing it into the atmosphere. So this is an ecological problem at its very heart. And today, the exchange of greenhouse gases with the land is mediated through natural systems. The best known example is probably that trees grow, they take up carbon. Actually, most habitats do, but trees are particularly good at it. On the other hand, there's also emissions from land. On the right there, this is on Exmoor, and the soil is peat. Peat is a great store of carbon, accumulated over thousands of years in many cases. But it's been turned into agricultural land. It's grazed with sheep, and our animals produce a significant amount of methane, particularly. That's a greenhouse gas. But also, if you look at the bare soil there, the bare soil, or the bare peat, is prone to oxidization. So carbon dioxide, and sometimes also methane as well, can go into the atmosphere from a degraded system like that. All of which, of course, contributes to climate change. So we zoom back to the global level, and the major fluxes of carbon. This is synthesizing a very complicated picture into quite a basic figure, I hope. But you can see two arrows pointing up. These are the sources of greenhouse gases, or carbon anyway, into the atmosphere. The biggest source of carbon is, as you might expect, fossil fuel burning. Something like 9.7 gigatons. We bandy around these numbers. A gigaton means nothing to anyone, but it's a blooming large number. So it's a vast amount of carbon that's going into the atmosphere from fossil fuels. A rather smaller amount comes from land use change, but still appreciable. And that includes the effects of particularly deforestation today, but also the large-scale degradation of peatlands. But these emissions are being offset naturally by the uptake by the land and also by the sea. Miss sea off of there, the blue arrow's the sea. So roughly a third of what is emitted in terms of fossil fuels gets taken up by vegetation on the land, and roughly a third goes into the sea. So if it wasn't for functioning carbon sinks they're referred to, we would be in an even worse state. Here in the UK, we've been reducing our emissions overall. We've been pretty good at transferring from fossil fuel for power to renewables, wind, to some extent solar. And overall, we have managed to halve our greenhouse gas emissions. That's the top line on that graph there. But the emissions that come from land, which is the agriculture, forestry, and other land uses, that's only slowly be decreasing compared to the overall rate of greenhouse gas emissions by the UK. So it's becoming proportionally more important, whereas it was 8% of emissions back in 1990. It's now 13% of emissions, even though it's fallen. It's proportionately more important. So it's becoming more and more important as we do remarkably get on top of the energy supply sector problems and transport increasingly. It's becoming more important to think about what happens on land. And there is good potential. So if you look at the overall emissions, last year's provisional figures, and again, I'm going to wave around figures that if you're not in the field won't mean much to you, but look at the relative difference. 371 megatons carbon dioxide equivalents per year going into the atmosphere. But UK forests, and I'll say right now, I'll be honest, the numbers the years don't entirely match up because there's a slight disconnect in when different things are published, but they're pretty much, the sense of it is still correct. So forests are removing about 18 of those 371 megatons of CO2 from the atmosphere. So it's having a beneficial effect, but it's more than offset by the amount that's coming out of our peatlands. So lots of potential for forests to actually be a sink in the UK and to help us get to that magical net zero aspiration. But we've also got to do a lot of work on other things like the big peatlands, like emissions from other parts of agriculture. So net zero has sadly become a bit of a potato recently, but it's not really a political concept. It's a physical one. The point at which emissions into the atmosphere are balanced by removals from the atmosphere. So that you actually don't have any rise in the greenhouse gas emissions of the atmosphere. Therefore, the warming stops. So globally, to hold global warming to 1.5 degrees of greenhouse gas emissions, what the world signed up to in the Paris Agreement, we would need radical action. So this is now slightly dated, but when this was looked at by the IPCC, it would have needed a decrease of 45% of emissions from 2010 levels by 2030. We are way off this. And then to reach net zero around 2050. And that's the origin of why the UK is aiming for net zero by 2050. And it is still very much set in law. But remember, it's a net. It's a balance between emissions and removals. And the only thing at the moment that will take large amounts of greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere are nature-based approaches. So tree planting, for example. So unless we see radical changes in the more mechanical, industrial approaches to carbon dioxide removal, nature is actually essential to achieving net zero. And globally, it's also really essential to maintain healthy systems, to maintain healthy carbon sinks, as well as all their other benefits. So I framed the title of the talk in terms of nature-based solutions. And This is very much building on where we've got to so far. I hope it comes across as a logical development from that background. But it's worth just briefly stepping into the world of climate change policy. And really, there's two ways you can respond to climate change in terms of delivering solutions. One is adaptation, which is all really about dealing with the effects. It's about building resilience, reducing vulnerability, accepting there will be more flooding, but making sure it doesn't flood into people's homes. And also adjusting to change. So in my day-to-day work in nature conservation, actually some of this is about coming to terms with the fact that the nature reserves we've protected will change. Doesn't mean they're going to be without value, but there might be different species there than where they were in the past. And we have to make the adaptation step so that we're protecting things in places where they can do best. So that's climate change adaptation. And in sort of general discussions, some of these distinctions are lost, I know, but within the climate change world, mitigation is all about tackling the causes of climate change, particularly reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but also sequestering more carbon. So bear that in mind as I go on. Now, nature-based solutions are not just about climate change. The concept was pioneered by the IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, who came up with quite a smart definition of it. That was then felt not to be a sufficiently wholesome definition, and when Environment Assembly agreed a very long definition of nature-based solutions. I'm not going to get bogged down on definitions, but the gist of both of those, at the heart of the matter, is addressing societal challenges, that's the word that's used, in ways that benefit people and biodiversity. So it could be, let's stay with flood defense. So, if we could have a hard engineering solution, we can build a flood wall to keep floods out, lots of concrete. Or maybe we can, like is happening in the Lake District around Selmere, we could have more trees in the catchment. We can have wetlands that are allowed to flood and store water. Wetlands are a great place for water. People's houses are not. So there's a win-win for people and nature in dealing with a problem. Doesn't have to be climate change, but that's my focus and where it's had a lot of traction. So nature-based solutions for climate change mitigation, they should be ones that are obvious already. Things like planting trees and restoring peatlands. And on top right there, you can see a picture of Bolton Fell Moss, which was a highly degraded peatland in Cumbria that's been restored, and it's doing very well, and the emissions falling. There are other habitats as well, perhaps less well known. Salt marsh, for example, can store carbon. It can both take it up from the atmosphere and it can also trap it. At the moment, that's not fully accounted for in our national accounting on greenhouse gases, but there's good potential there. Grasslands, got lots of grasslands in this country. They can be sources of emissions, but they can also, if we manage them well, in a very sort of low intensity way, with not too many livestock, they can also take up and store carbon. And yeah, this just amplifies those points a bit. So yeah, the forests, I suppose one thing is that we do need to get the right species, and to be a truly nature-based solution, in my book anyway, it should be with native species or species at least almost native. We allow it to stretch a little into Europe, and it needs to be sustainably managed. It's not to say that commercial conifer plantation cannot be good for climate, but it's rarely good for nature in my experience. There are tweaks you can do though to improve that. And peatlands, yes, we can restore peatlands. And we can protect the ones that are already there. And yeah, again, on the coast, protecting the salt marsh we have and protecting natural processes. It will form quite naturally, but we've often stopped it by hard sea defences. And I'll show you a bit more in a minute. Grassland I've talked about. There is also potential for what's sometimes called agroecological farming, or well, there's various names. I mean, some aspects of organic agriculture, and there's a word that's slipped me. Anyway, more nature-friendly farming, including getting more trees into an agricultural landscape, forestry, for example. So there's quite a bit we can do there. But to get the sort of scale of change that would really make a difference in the UK, you need a lot of change. And this was a study that was done a few years ago by the Climate Change Committee. And people have been producing a whole range of different variants on this. And there's an awful lot of work going on at the moment. I thought about updating this slide, but I'm not going to, just for now, because the government's own land use framework will come out fairly soon, hopefully, which will also set another direction here. But you get a sense of the scale of change that might be needed to actually make a decent contribution to greenhouse gas emissions. Something like 22% of agricultural land converted to forests, peatland restoration, or biofuels. I'm not going to talk about them, they're not really nature-based solutions, but growing crops that can form fuel. An increase in forest cover from 13% to 17%, which entails something like 30,000 hectares a year forest creation, which we are not at that level, it's fair to say. Now, there's all sorts of questions come around there, and some of the points I'll make towards the end are relevant here about what's fair to people who are actually farming the land. You know, it's not reasonable to expect farmers who've responded to all the different government pressures and demands, you know, to get where we are, that they should bear the burden of land. But it is worth saying that actually we have a lot of land that does not yield very high amounts of food. So targeting this to places that are more marginal, but doing it in a way that respects local communities and farming, there is a way through there, I think. Just briefly about climate change adaptation, nature-based solutions. A classic one is, yet again, salt marshes. We'll say a little bit about that in a moment, but also restoring river systems to, again, I've mentioned it already, but this rewiggling of rivers, having a more natural channel can help slow things down. And then in the city, we've seen how green spaces in cities tend to be cooler. Well, we can deliberately green our buildings. We can put little green spaces in. And then, yes, also by the way we manage land for agriculture, we can do things like improve how much water goes into the soil. Skip that. So to make this tangible, this is a specific example. So the Sturt Peninsula on the Bristol Channel in Somerset. This is an example of where salt marsh has been created from what was agricultural land. So rising sea levels were already threatening old sea defences. So the Environment Agency, who maintained them, needed to find a solution. Just leaving it be wasn't going to work. And something like 300 hectares of salt marsh were recreated on what was agricultural land. And that would have been reversing the process of drainage for agricultural improvement that occurred, well, hundreds of years ago, potentially. And there's something about that that goes against the psyche for a lot of people. But on the other hand, it is going with the flow of nature, and it is recognizing the inevitability of sea level rise as ice caps melt and as water expands with warmer temperatures. So a lot of work was done to model how flood risk could be managed in a different way. And so new embankments in the raised areas of land were placed further back to allow the water level to rise locally and to flood fields. It's good for flood defense, but also created habitats for many species, particularly birds. You could carry on getting some agricultural productivity, graze cattle on there. And visitors came and loved it and still love it. It's a great place to visit if you're in the area. And one of the key elements here is that it was a partnership. It wasn't the government says you will do this. It was a partnership between government agencies, particularly the Environment Agency, but also the Wildfire and Wetlands Trust, who actually manage the nature reserve that's there, and also with local communities. And some years was spent working with the communities. Obviously, the farmers had to be bought out. And at the early stages, this sort of thing is often very controversial. But actually, over time, it became accepted and, you know, a fair solution was reached. So it all sounds great, nature-based solutions, but there are some caveats. So first of all, climate change itself may threaten the viability of some nature-based solutions. So rising sea levels, if we are going to create new coastal habitats like salt marsh, well, we need to be prepared for the fact that they will probably need to sometimes say just roll back, move inland as sea level rises if they're to have a long-term future. Planting trees is great, but if the trees are not suitable for the future climate that we might experience, then we'll be back to square one if they die, won't we? So taking account of that. Now that might mean species that are more often found further south, for example, but it may just be about looking carefully. So beech trees are quite sensitive to droughts, which we're getting more of with climate change. The hornbeam is a rather similar species that is better able to cope. So if it's factored in at the planning stage, you can reduce those risks. And you can use a mixture of different trees. That's good practice to hedge your bets in a way. And yes, wetlands may dry out in dry conditions. So planning needs to take account of the changing climate context. But also, sadly, it's the case that nature-based solutions have often been badly implemented. And the classic one is planting trees in bad places. And there's been a not very attractive legacy in some parts of the world of global north corporations and NGOs identifying apparently deforested areas that could do with some trees in the global south. For example, in savannas. Savannas are naturally sparsely wooded, and planting trees into them is not good for the savanna, it's not good for the trees. Even in this country, planting trees on peat is not always a good way. It's usually a bad thing to do because our peatlands are often normally treeless, except at the very edges. And some of the problem is when people don't take account of local knowledge. Often the right thing to do, or at least a knowledge of what was likely to be the wrong thing to do, is there. It hasn't been taken account of, and particularly in that development context. You know, the host of problems created by that. One of the other things is that sometimes this can be seen as an easy win. We don't need to cut emissions because we'll just plant trees. We're never going to be able to plant enough trees to soak up all the greenhouse gases emissions that we currently are making. There is not enough land. So it needs to be realistic. And there is a tendency for what's often seen as greenwash and corporations overstating the benefits of schemes that they've got behind. So a lot of my time is really about trying to bring an independent, unbiased, best way we can be, hard-nosed look at these things. I just wanted to touch briefly on some of the potential nature-based problems, if I can put it that way. And it really does matter to try and build the resilience and protect healthy ecosystems and not see them as an easy quick win. There's something like 3 to 5 times as much carbon in soils and trees within the ecosystem as there is in unextracted fossil fuels. If what has been carbon sinks become carbon sources and start releasing that, as there is some evidence in some parts of the world, we have a very, very much bigger problem to deal with. And there's a risk of a really vicious circle. More warming causing more release of carbon and the whole thing getting worse and worse. We can also see that things like wildfires, insect pests and so on, they can also contribute to this. And there's a lot of complex interactions involved. And finally, there's a lot of interest at the moment in tipping points, things that if you exceed this point, then will we get to a point where we can't hold on to an ecosystem that's already there? A lot of uncertainty, but these are all a reason really for accelerating action on the fossil fuel problem. Coming towards the end, I want to touch a bit on the human dimension. And we've already seen this, I've already started to talk about it, but just to sort of summarize that, we have to get nature-based solutions right if they're going to deliver their promise. And the right action in the right place is essential. And that needs to take account of the current state of an ecosystem. If it's a degraded system, then it maybe we restore it, or maybe it has a different use. If it's pristine, we really want to hold on to it. We need to bring together scientific and practical knowledge. We need to take note of local knowledge, and in some parts of the world, indigenous knowledge is really important. And there's been a lot of recognition of that often indigenous peoples who've had virtually nothing to do with the causes of the problem are the ones who are really bearing the brunt. And so, local as well as national leadership is important. And even in this country, our Nature Returns programme, it's been great working with locally based partnerships. And we've supported them, we've financed them sometimes, but actually they've led. And that's right, because they know their land. And equity and justice considerations are important to all of this. As I say, those who've caused the problems should really be the ones who bear the brunt of dealing with the solutions. And I suppose the best way of approaching this, perhaps, to build on another existing framework is to see all this through the sustainable development lens. The Sustainable Development Goals are widely accepted, and they're a very comprehensive approach to balancing the social and environmental requirements. So my own small part of this is through the IPCC, contributing to our work around what we call climate resilient development. This was a paper that was in Nature Climate Change last year. And you can see, this is quite a complex, my colleague Syria Nixon could take you through every point of this. It would be brilliant. It would take about 10 minutes. So I'm going to be very brief. You can see these show different pathways from the present to the future. And there are different bifurcations in the pathway. And as you go progressively down one way, you start to close off options. So you've really got to start moving early. It's obviously very conceptual to get in the right direction. But what we want to get to, that whole sort of system of benefits. So low greenhouse gas emissions, yeah. A wider system transformation in the way we not just manage the land, but also function as society. So we have low climate risk, we have equity and justice, the sustainable development goals are achieved. It's the kind of heaven and hell sort of contrast. The red lines take you downwards to a place where you don't want to be, which is the flip side. So another human dimension on it, of course, is who pays. So one might say governments of the global north, businesses, perhaps, those who benefited. That would seem the obvious one. But one of the things people often debate is around the benefit of offsetting. So allowing you to carry on emitting as long as you offset your emissions by taking up greenhouse gases or by planting trees. And the term that's often used for this is those markets, the carbon markets, are the Wild West. And I put it in inverted commas because I've heard it so many times, but it's that idea of an unregulated frontier. And basically, yes, it's possible, but it's going to need good monitoring, good reporting and validation. And only really for emissions that can't be dealt with through greater efficiency or, things like changing fuels. Skip that. So I want to come on to my Christian perspective, promised from the beginning. And this is a bit of a change of gear, but I hope you see the way I'm building up. We've been drifting, well, hopefully not drifting, marching towards it. And just a few of the sort of, I suppose, the anchors in the Bible that people look to. And Genesis, it's funny, isn't it? As a scientist in the 80s, it was all the sort of science and religion, how can we defend Genesis? Can we defend Genesis? But actually we're in a different space now. We're actually, how can we learn from these ancient texts? Because, there's just something there that's quite helpful today. The idea that the world was very good, that there's a value to the earth. It's very deeply there within Christian theology. And the idea of God forming people from the dust of the ground and breathing his breath into them. And I think that's a really powerful image about what it is to be human. Yes, we are the dust of the earth, as the Dasgupta review recognized. We are nothing, our bodies, they wouldn't be here without the world that sustains us. But nevertheless, we can stand back from that, be something else, and there is something of the breath of God in us. With Christians, we will believe. And then finally, this instruction, God's first instruction, work the garden, but take care of it. See, that if I was a theologian, I might spend a whole lecture talking about the words behind that. But the sense of caretaking, I think you can see it there. So the concept of stewardship, it's a common concept in Christian environmental ethics. But one of the things I've found is it's really quite relatable to others. So in our IPCC report, you will find that one of the sort of systems transitions that we need is described as environmental stewardship. I wasn't involved in that discussion, and I saw it and I thought, that's interesting. But it struck a chord that went, across a whole range of different cultures. And stewardship's ultimately all about accountability. We look after something that isn't ours. Accountability to God from a more secular perspective, but also very consistent with Christian thought, future generations. Now, there's no doubt that stewardship has been critiqued. It is quite anthropocentric, but in my experience, people are quite anthropocentric. So it does strike a chord, I think. But it does need to be different in different situations. What was good stewardship in the Middle Ages? It's quite different to now. But there is an urgent need to meet the needs of both people and nature in a joined up way. We can't solve the nature crisis, the climate crisis, in isolation from each other. And then, as we've seen, the effects of climate change are often most apparent to the poor and the vulnerable. And the costs of the mistakes that we make in trying to respond are also often borne by them. So respect and care for all, particularly the poor and vulnerable, is at the heart of the Christian gospel and strikes a chord here with me. And equity and justice runs through the gospel and needs to be run through our climate action. And finally, this concept of the common good, something quite prominent in Catholic teaching as well, that we're all affected and we need to find a solution. So this is my last slide, and I'll just rattle through that quickly and we can talk. So I think the concept of nature-based solutions can provide a holistic vision, and we really need that, for tackling nature and climate problems in a joined-up way. I think it is very compatible with a Christian environmental stewardship ethic, but also is relatable to many people with other different worldviews. My experience as well is that in many, but not all countries, it translates well into policy. It plays well in this country, Western Europe. There are some others that have some doubts because of the history of things being done wrong in the past, but generally it lands well. But they have to be delivered well, and it does. And I would suggest that actually delivering nature-based solutions needs that wider ethical framework if it's truly going to deliver its potential. From a Christian point of view, obviously, my Christian faith is shaping that. But I think from a secular perspective, the Sustainable Development Goals is another one. And my last point is no substitute for phasing out fossil fuels. I'll stop there.
The need for house planting and how that fits in with all this. House planting, if only we could.
Yeah, I mean, I think in this country, we're a growing population in a relatively small land area for our size of population. So the critical thing is deciding what is the right place for everything. And, this has been recognized for a long time. And successive governments across both of the main parties, or were the main parties, I'm not sure if they are anymore, but Labour and Conservative, have identified the need for a land use framework which sets out some of those priorities. And I think, there's not a smart, easy answer, but I think, it needs to be factored in alongside the need to produce food, to safeguard nature. And it's tough, but I think there are ways in which we can square that circle, but it's going to have to be very tight targeting. I also think, a housing development doesn't have to be a wildlife desert. And often we don't develop the full potential for building nature into developments. And actually, by things like planting native trees, rather than just any old sort of garden, municipal planting sort of tree, by having wetlands that can form where some of the drainage water goes, you can integrate biodiversity much better into it. So I think trying to look for those win-win solutions is the answer, in as much as there is one, but it's not easy.
Yeah, and there's a question about how can we put a numerical value in nature for these sorts of economic calculations?
With great difficulty. I mean, the way I look on this, and obviously it is a big field, and I'm not a sort of natural capital economist, but I think you can value services that nature provides, things like water and carbon. You can put a value on it, either a market value, well, probably a market value, what people would be prepared to pay. But for me, that isn't the whole value of that nature. So I think you can value elements of it, the services, but that's never the whole value of it. And I think value is more than economic value, and that needs to be recognised in all those discussions.
Thank you very much for a fascinating talk. Coming at this from a theological standpoint, I have to say that my heart rather sinks when I hear this language of stewardship, and I know it's a sort of common catch-all term for responsible environmental behavior, but it's theologically, I find very superficial, and what I was hoping might be a bit more developed is the way in which nature-based solutions is actually, it's more studentship than stewardship. It's actually looking at the wisdom, the rationality in a world that is created by the word and wisdom of God, and how these actually teach us as part of the whole physical system. And that, I think, it changes our attitude and how quickly we assume that we have the answers. And yeah, I'll stop there. We have very little time. But it's also a way to seeing essentially a spiritual value in the natural world as the way that God speaks to us, rather than simply treating it as a pool of resources, albeit one that we're meant to take care of and not exploit.
I think I think this is a really interesting debate. As you gather, I'm not a theologian, and I think there's a lot to be said for what what you've just articulated. I do think finding reverence, finding meaning, and as you say, learning. I quite like that one, actually, of being a student of nature from the natural world. I suppose I work a lot in a policy and practical context, and I'm very much an applied scientist in my day job, and it can be quite hard to land those messages, I think. Whereas I think stewardship, because of that idea of accountability to someone else or something else, I think can land a little more easily. I think all of these things become a little bit of a, it becomes jargon, doesn't it? It becomes shorthand. And actually, I think it's well worth unpacking some of these things. And, that's what theology is there for, I think, to understand some of that richness and perhaps to expand that concept. So, no, thank you. It's a very good point.
Yes, Christian.
Thanks. Your talk really resonated with me. As it happens, I was talking to a number of young people about climate change this morning. What two things would you say to them in terms of advice or perspective?
Oh gosh. I think one shouldn't generalize young people just as one shouldn't generalize old people, and I think it depends where they're coming from. But I think I would say don't give in to a sort of fatalism, because I think there is a great danger at the moment that people recognize a problem and then they just lose hope and think there's nothing we can do. And I still do believe we can't perhaps truly solve the problem in the case of making everything go away and everything be fine, but we can certainly make the world a much better place for them, particularly, rather than a much worse place, which is what we're doing at the moment. But so I think it's don't give up, but also look for what practical opportunities there are to make a difference. I've taken to saying, when people ask me sort of slightly doom-laden questions, well, I'd rather, personally for myself, I go to bed at night thinking, if I can go to bed at night thinking, well, I'm a small part of the solution rather than a small part of the problem. That's perhaps as much as any of us can be, really.
Thanks very much for a really interesting lecture. I tend to think of Job chapter 8 and the authorized version, speak to the earth and it will teach you. And there's an alternative translation, speak to the trees and bushes and they will teach you, which is one of those wonderful ambiguities in Hebrew. Now, I actually work on atmospheric methane, and we've been looking pretty hard at the problems of agricultural methane emissions and come to a couple of conclusions. One is that the best thing to do is feed additives to diet, but not to cows, but to humans. They're called Ozempic and things like that, which then reduces the human demand for food. And obesity is a massive global problem. But in many cases, countries try to hit national targets and actually make the whole problem worse. If you fly over eastern Bolivia or parts of Amazonia, you can see where this enormous extension of agriculture is going on. And much of that is going to export food, which then replaces. So if you then rewild Britain, or cover some prime agricultural land and solar panels, you're basically eventually through the markets increasing the demand for food from Amazonia, which is where our big new resources are coming from. And so if you look at it, the planet as a whole has a mixed atmosphere. We're all together in the same problem. Sometimes we may take actions locally that actually make the problem worse rather than better. How do you tackle that?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really important issue. And I did show, I didn't want to get too far down this line, but yeah, I only showed the territorial emissions rather than our sort of footprint on the world. I mean, I think we do have to maintain food production here, and also I'd say we need to increase timber production here, despite the fact I'm slightly sniffy about conifer plantations, but actually, I do actually want to see more British timber in our houses, and it. Yeah, I think that does to some extent. I mean, I think there's something like, if you're growing tomatoes in this country, you're going to use much more energy than if you bring them in from Spain, for example. So it's not, it's a more nuanced thing, but I think it's ultimately is about looking for efficiency and actually in terms of emissions, but also ultimately, hopefully, cost as well. It's a perverse thing if it's cheaper to fly stuff from South America here. So no, it's not easy, is it? But no, I agree with you.
Thank you. I feel bad at drawing stumps on the question, but we need to let people get on with their days. Do linger to chat if you're here in person. Thank you very much, Mike, for everything that you've presented to us today.